start with the first slide. Okay, so what you see here is the first slide, postage stamps, each overprinted, showing inflation, hyperinflation, in fact, starting with a 5,000 mark overprint, going down through the 800, 250,000, 800,000, 400,000, and 2 million at the bottom of the page. Second slide, please. And here we start with 500,000, and then the second line, 1 million, 2, 4, 5, third line, 10, 20, 30, 50, fourth line, 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, and then we get to the fifth line, 1 milliarder. A milliard is the equivalent of our billion. So it's 1 milliard, 2 milliarden, 5, 10, 20, 50 milliarden, and then the penultimate line, 10, 20, 10 milliarden, 20, 50, 200 milliarden. So that is 200 billion marks. And that just illustrates hyperinflation. And the effect it had on people was that if you had savings, then they became worthless. And you can see if you're having to spend that sort of money on a single postage stamp, then money in the bank just becomes meaningless. And if you have the next slide, please. Here you see an inflationary cover from October 1923. So it's got 60 million marks in stamps on it. 1923 inflation. Next slide, please. So here, what is very interesting is a very rare stamp you see on the envelope on the right-hand side. Okay, the normal stamp you see on the left in the black folder, and it says at the top in an arc, Deutsch Österreich, and that was the standard Austrian stamp. And then what someone did was they replaced the word Deutsch with the word Jüdisch. And not only that, but it went through the post in a regular way, because obviously the postal authorities didn't notice. And so what you see on the right-hand side is an envelope went through the post. And if you look very carefully in the arc, the writing over the double eagle, you see Jüdisch Österreich, Jewish Austria. And that was, well, that was a parody, but it was anti-Semitic because they were obviously having a go at the degree of control that Jews were believed to exercise over the country. Okay, next slide, please. And here you see something that was a label on the back of regular postal envelopes, which were anti-Semitic, but anti-Semitic not in a crude way, but in a fairly intellectual way. So the one of them reads, "Can one," in translation, "can one talk recklessly about every other religion, race and class, and only against Israel dare not say a critical word? That would be a wonderful challenge. It's so strange as it seems to be made by people that daily claim tolerance." And then the other one reads, "It must be pointed out here that as regards the Jews in their dealings where they occur in history, they were hated by all nations without exception, not because of their religion. The general hostility towards the Jews had other reasons. Firstly, in the fear of the Jews of any actual work, and secondly, in their set prescribed hostility against all non-Jews." And those are both quotes on envelopes that were posted in January and February of 1921. So anti-Semitism being exhibited then. We move to the next slide, please. And this is just another business postcard showing hyperinflation, bearing 12 200 million marks postage stamps from what had been sent by what had been a Jewish business, Hermann and Ettlinger, which was a business that made leather gloves for ladies at that time. But again, just for a postcard, needed 2,400 million marks postage. Next slide, please. Again, another inflationary envelope with 18 stamps, each of 1 milliard, i.e. billion marks. So 18 billion marks of November 1923. And then next slide, please. Looking at currency, starting at the top left, 1 mark note, 2 marks, and then 1,000 marks, and then 200,000 marks. And the next slide, please. Okay, 1 million marks, 50 million marks, 10 milliarden marks, 10 billion marks. So you can see banknotes illustrating that hyperinflation. Then the next slide, please. 10 million mark note, and on the back of that note is what you see on the right hand side. The Jewish bank now has the gold, the dirt remains in your hand. Dirt is a polite translation of dreck, which means something a bit more crude. So this is an example of the Germans blaming the Jews for the inflation suffered by their currency, and saying basically the Jews have got the gold, we've got rubbish notes. And again, next slide, please. And the left, what you see is a 10,000 mark banknote, which became worthless, and so it was used for propaganda purposes. And the translation, as you can see there, and we're looking at November 1923. No peace, no freedom, no bread. The Jews are still getting renter marks like they were a gold loan. So the Jews are doing all right, and we're suffering. And then you see a postcard. Everywhere you reach out, Jews will hold. Wherever God's chosen people goes, lock them away again in the alleys old. Before they you in a Christian quarter enclose. German Aryans, free yourselves from the Jewish control. Help the United Front form an apolitical Austrian Defence Association, Anti-Semites Alliance. So this is all in the 1920s, okay? And it sets the scene for what happened, obviously, when Hitler came to power a decade later. Next slide, please. And this is just one example of many of the banknote, which is there in the background, just printed with an anti-Semitic Jewish, obviously crude Jewish caricature, speaking into a microphone labelled London, and you can recognise the prophet by his beard. Dear Germans, sad man, because you martyrs are threatening us, your leaders are conquerors, and you are sacrificial lambs. That's why don't rely on them and just hold on and trust them. So you've got to see here, I hope, the link between German hyperinflation, which ruined the middle and upper classes' own wealth, and anti-Semitism, which grew out of that through a widespread blaming of Jews. Next slide, please. Another example of an anti-Semitic banknote with the message on it about the Soviet Jew Radek, railroad robber, labourer, murderer, biggest capitalist in Russia. Again, whether he was or he wasn't, but that's the message being sent out, handed out on these worthless now banknotes as anti-Semitic propaganda. And yet another one at the next slide. Judaism is organised gangsterism. Vote for the National Socialist list. So German National Socialist, i.e. Nazi propaganda. And you can see they're linking three things. Top left of the overprint on the note, the Star of David, the compass and set square, in other words, masonry, and the hammer and sickle, communism. So in the eyes of the Germans, anti-Semitism, or Jews, Masons, and Bolsheviks, communists, are all being linked together, and that was a theme all the way through the Nazi era. Okay, next slide, please. So we now move on to a couple of Notgeld, and these were local notes that were produced because, in effect, to operate as local currency, because the mainstream currency wasn't available. So it's only a 50 pfennig note, but they didn't lose an opportunity in these beautifully produced notes to have a go at the Jews. So what you see at the top is the swastika, and then it translates as: the free German became a serf, the Jew falsifies German law and gives the proceeds to his heirs. The farmer flees from home and hearth, seeks overseas a place to lie down and die. Instead of royal law, it's Jewish gold now reigns. It's a fine art, it's paid service to the Jew. The noble man must bow his neck, the Jew is brazen, the German pale. Oh, you beautiful German Reich, you must now shatter into pieces. So those are examples of the local currency that was being produced for different towns. And then a next slide is an absolutely beautifully produced set of Notgeld. Next slide. Depicting an alleged desecrator of the host, dating from 1492. So allegedly the host used in the Catholic service at Mass was taken by or sold to or stolen by Jews, who then desecrated it, and as a punishment the host desecrators were put to a fiery death, as you see in the three different Notgeld notes there. And it was for 100 pfennig, so it's, you know, it's loose change, as it were, for the town of Sternberg. So these were just circulating locally, but they lost no opportunity, even with beautiful printing and beautiful design, to be anti-Semitic. Okay, next slide, please. And here we have an anti-Semitic postcard. German Master Widows and Orphans Foundation, action in the field, and there you see the caricature Jews in the picture on the left, and on the right a postcard, the anti-Semitic Austrian postcard showing the masthead of the Wiener Journal, dated 1919, beneath which is a fat lady peering through lorgnettes at a caricature of a Jewish parrot. And the following, on the reverse, is the following message: he who carries his money to the Jews beats themselves with their own fists. Don't buy Jewish newspapers. Through its press, we are dominated by the Jewish people. So obviously the Wiener Journal was Jewish owned, and this is 1919 telling people not to buy the Jewish owned newspapers. Okay, next slide, please. Here we have an original handbill advertising a speech with, on the right, the German or the English translation of it, and this is a speech that's going to be taking place in 1921 by a judge, Mr. Jenner, who's a district judge in Berlin, and he will speak about German law. And in the second paragraph, he will speak especially in the struggle against the ever-increasing encroachment of Judaism, against the enslavement of the people under the rule of predominantly Jewish banking, and stock market capital, against the profiteering and usury that has not been adequately addressed by law, against the predominance of individual greed over consideration for the needs of the common good, a change to our legislation to bring about laws and institutions that correspond to the historical development of the German people and the German national sentiment has become urgently necessary. And so this was the Munich branch of the German Nationalist Protection and Defence League that had organised this meeting. And at the very bottom of the page on the right, you can see 4 words: Juden haben keinen Zutritt. Jews are not permitted entry. So here you have something in effect from a judge addressing what is bound to be seen as an anti-Semitic meeting, but not crude. It's intellectual. It's looking at the law and how the Jews have had an influence on it. Okay, next slide, please. This is ironic, and it's a handbill against the well-known financial Jew J.P. Morgan, who earns 5.5 million marks daily, as much as 1.1 million German workers. And it's saying he inherited $3.750 billion from his father, a tricky stock market man, invested his money with interest, and so on and so forth. But the irony is that J.P. Morgan wasn't Jew. He was not a Jew. He was not Jewish. They obviously assumed that because he was rich, filthy rich, and had the name Morgan, he must be a Jew, but he wasn't. And I mean, the Morgan name carries on to this day: Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan, Morgan Chase. So there we are. But they labelled him as a Jew, and here you can see that anti-Semitism linked with wealth, finances, and comparing it with the lot of the German worker. Over, next slide, please. And this is a flyer. Die Freiheit in Gefahr. Freedom is in danger. Again, your freedom is in danger from Jews. And here it quotes the Talmud: "The time will come when every Jew will have 2,684 servants." Mark you, servants. And then the largest funds are in Jewish ownership. Rothschild, Bleichroeder, Warschauer, Mendelssohn, Friedlander, Full, Goodman, Simon James, etc. are Jews. I don't think it's the same Simon as whose house I'm in at the moment, but you can see the point here. Jews have got money. And here are the Jewish Masonic Lodge in Milan issued the slogan years ago: "Removal of all thrones and altars." One of the main aims of the war fomented by Jewish lodges. So, and then the terror, robbery and murder economy in Russia, known as Bolshevism, is run by Jews. Here you see the Nazis linking Jews with money, with usury, with Masonic lodges, and with Bolshevism. And it's freedom that's in danger from Jews. And then the next slide, please, is a postcard advertising an exhibition arranged by the Nazis called The Eternal Jew, Der Ewige Jude. And this was a very anti-Semitic exhibition that was designed to reinforce the anti-Semitism that was rife. And so, and this was 1937-8, already during the Hitler years. So what I hope you can see from what we've seen so far, which, I mean, it's only a sample of the anti-Semitic material that was circulating at the time, was how hyperinflation and the agonies that produced for the German population were directly being linked to Jews, their wealth, and their organization of Bolshevism, and their scheming through Masonic lodges, to the detriment of the German population. And this is only a small sample, but you can multiply it 100-fold, and see the anti-Semitism in the newspapers, in the media, in currency, in everyday meetings, and the obvious hatred that generated in the German population, that it was so relentless and so widespread that perhaps it begins to help us to understand how the Germans could turn their conduct into what led ultimately to the Holocaust. And the thing I think that we here in England now should be asking ourselves is, would any of this propaganda actually be illegal in England? You know, there is no general law of in relation to hatred. Yes, it would be illegal in England if that was threatening violence against people, but none of these things that we've seen are actually threatening violence against Jews. They're just saying what horrible and despicable people the Jews are, and look what they've done to us. But they weren't actually advocating violence. And so, as I say, one has to ask oneself, would any of these things that we've seen, and 100 more like it, actually be illegal in England today? Anyway, next slide, please. Moving on. So we come to elections, and this is an election flyer, and the top half are the people that could be elected if you vote for Hindenburg, and the bottom half, the people who would be elected if you voted for Hitler. And when you look at the names, if you can see them on the screen big enough, you've got Jews in the top half: Brzezinski, Weiss, Bernhard, Hirschfeld, Crispian, Stegwald. So they're Jews. And at the bottom half, the Hitler team, you've got Goering, Rosenberg, Döhm, Litzmann, Frick, Goebbels, etc. if you vote for Hitler. So it's a fairly straightforward voting propaganda. Again, it's not advocating violence. It's just say these are the people who will be elected to power if you vote for Hindenburg, and with a large number of Jews in it. And these are the people who will be elected if you vote for Hitler. In other words, vote for Hitler. Okay, next slide. We'll pass over that one. Next slide, please. Again, Jewish premises were the subject of an attempted boycott, and so this is a photo with people on side saying basically, don't boycott Jewish shops in Berlin, and this is a news agency photo showing that. And the reality is that people wouldn't cross that sort of demonstration, and so it was part of the economic war against the Jews. Okay, next slide, please. We see here on the left a Nazi propaganda postcard showing the influence of Jews in the German parliament and how it had been reduced by the Nazis. So you can see that in 1919 you have 7 white figures, 1923 1, 1933 1, 1936 1. So this is showing how the number of Jewish MPs has steadily been reducing from 1919 through to 1936, reducing Jewish influence because of the success of the Nazis. And then you've got a propaganda postcard showing the hammer-wielding Nazi with a swastika belt buckle. Let Marxism die so that socialism may live. and then that was promoting the National Socialist newspaper, but basically linking again Marxism with the Jews. Okay, next slide, please. This is a very innocent looking but very sinister document. I think we're all familiar with getting in the post these days when we want to go and when we have an election, we get a polling card in the post, and this is exactly what this is. It's an ordinary polling card with an address to someone on the reverse, so you can't see it. It's plebiscite election to the Greater German Parliament, 10th of April 1938, a ballot card for the person named in writing. Voting time is 10th of April 1938, 8 o'clock in the morning till 17 o'clock in the afternoon. This ballot card is presented for stamping at the voting booth. It will be handed back as proof of the performance of voting and arrive at the ballot box early, the mayor. You can see it's a ballot card. But what's sinister then is what appears in German, which I'll translate at the bottom of the card. Whoever uses the right to vote, even though he is excluded from the right to vote, or is a Jew, or it is known to him that he is descended from at least 3 completely Jewish grandparents, or else is married as a half-breed, at least 2 Jewish grandparents, to a Jewish person, must immediately send back this ballot card to the council office and must stay away from the poll. He otherwise lays himself open to stringent penalties. In other words, what you see here is the disenfranchisement of Jews. And it's not secret, it's quite open. Every single German would have received, adult anyway, would have received their ballot card with that wording on it. And so they accepted, as it were, the disenfranchisement of the Jews from voting in 1938. Okay, next slide, please. This is one of those random survivors. It was on the back of something which was put together in a photograph album. And I mean, I'm holding the original here, and there are little pictures on the back. Some German had used these simply as paper mounts for their photos. But what it is details of those Jews whose German citizenship has been revoked by German law. And this page survived because it was used by someone to mount their family photos in an album. And here, you can see the surname, forename, and the date of birth. Feisenthal, Erich Israel, 1874, Aachen businessman, and last address in Düsseldorf. And so it just is someone who had their citizenship removed. And what you see here is his middle name is given as Israel, Erich Israel Feisenthal, and you'll see again some examples. But under German law, every Jewish man who had an ordinary first name like Erich had to insert in their name the middle name Israel, and women had to do the same with the name Sarah, so as to identify them in all written correspondence, documentation, etc., as Jews. Okay, next slide, please. And here we see the first of a few documents with the Malinov family, Adolf Malinov. This document on the left is an inventory of his assets as at the 27th of April 1938. And he gives, first of all, his personal details, and then it's a list going down this page, and it's a booklet. I mean, I can only show you the front page on the screen, but there are several pages in this booklet where he has to list and value all of his assets, and in particular for him, it's his business assets, working clothes, and shop. And you can see it says halfway down on the page or towards the right, his religion is Jewish. So that's his signed inventory of assets. And then the next slide, please. You'll see the balance sheet in showing his active and passive assets of 20,262 rent and marks, and then the next page, please. Right, what you've got here is a letter from the police president in Breslau to the firm of Adolf Malinowitzer, permitting him to reopen his business and commence trading again. And then typed, you see, my decision of 11/11 this year regarding the closure of your business enterprise has been rescinded. I hereby temporarily cancel it. The business can consequently continue provisionally to operate. And so apparently he was now allowed to open his business. But then you see a manuscript note there, which this is a later handwritten comment by his wife, and this is the translation. After I had been open for an hour on the 18th of November, the police closed the store again and my husband was arrested. We were given until the 31st of December 1938 at the latest to sell the business on the understanding that 30% of the valuation will accrue to the Nazi tax collector. So here you see concrete evidence of the expropriation of assets from Jews in the Malinov family. And moving to the next one, next slide, please. And so Malinov, with that business enterprise, has given notice of departure. In other words, he's emigrating from the country. And then the next slide, please. A non-objection certificate from the Lord Mayor of Breslau. Fiscal obligations against the emigration of Adolf Israel Malinov, again middle name inserted, businessman, and his wife Erna Sarah, business middle name inserted, née Bandmann, born resident here, will not be asserted. So they're not asserting any fiscal objections to their emigration because their business has been sold, 30% tax has been obtained, and they're now free to emigrate. And the next slide, please. We see a banknote, Conversionkasse. These were the notes given to Jews who were lucky enough to escape Germany in the early years in exchange for all their property in their German marks. And trouble was when they tried to exchange these notes at banks when they were abroad, they found them to be worthless. So they were given worthless notes in payment, as it were, for the businesses that they had been forced to surrender. Next slide, please. So Bekanntmachung, this is a notice. As a trustee of Jewish property, I possess with immediate effect all the rental and lease payments arising from previous contracts from Jewish property. They're to be paid promptly only to the fiduciary account, utilization of Jewish assets in Kreisparkasse Wadowitz. And so, in the event of non-compliance with the due date, I shall ruthlessly have the eviction or cancellation of the usufruct of the leased property. So, in other words, if a Jew owned property that had been rented out to a tenant, this was a notification to the tenant that the rent from then on had to be paid to the trustee of Jewish property into his account utilization of Jewish assets, so obviously the money stopped going to Jews but went to the trustee of the Jewish assets. Okay, next slide, please. We're now moving into wartime occupied France, 1941, 31st October, and this is a multi-page document, six pages plus 2 annexes. I'm only showing the front here, but this is a circular that went to all insurance companies in France, basically saying to them that if a Jew-owned property business in France makes an insurance claim, then you're not to pay it. And you can understand that there'd be no point in Germans stealing, robbing Jewish businesses, if the Jewish businessman could then turn around to his insurers and make a claim. So this is a detailed instruction to insurers to the effect that they're not to pay out the claim. And one of the issues here is to identify the people who were actually Jewish, and there's multiple pages dealing with that, starting here on the front page with physical persons. Under the terms of the German ordinance, is considered as Jewish all persons of at least 3 grandparents of pure Jewish race, and so on and so forth. And then they have to deal with partnerships, and they have to deal with companies, and when is a company a Jewish company, and so on. And it goes into huge detail, and I haven't got all that detail here, but I can assure you it runs over 6 pages plus 2 detailed annexes identifying the criteria which would make a limited company a Jewish enterprise. Very, very detailed, and to make sure that insurers didn't pay out on claims made by Jews or Jewish-owned companies or businesses. Next slide, please. This is simply the envelope from the Jewish Center in Romania, which enclosed a letter dealing with Jewish assets in Romania, and that's the letter and an explanation of it. But if you turn to the next slide, then this is the letter it contained, which in translation is basically saying that according to Article 3 of the Decree Law, in the fight against camouflaged assets and rights and interests of Jews, published in the Official Gazette, any acts or actions that occurred at the time from September 6, 1940 until the date of publication between Jewish individuals and legal entities with Jewish participation and people of any ethnicity or real estate, business of goods, funds trading, etc., must be declared within the period stipulated by law. And so basically this was intended to disclose any transactions by Jews that might be intended to hide their assets by having them owned by a non-Jew on their behalf, should we say. Hence the fight against camouflaged assets, because it's all very well stealing the government in Romania stealing assets from Jews, but if the Jews had passed those assets to a non-Jewish friend, then the government couldn't do it. So this is ordering them to disclose any transactions, and hence that would identify any such arrangements. Okay, next slide, please. And here we see postcards sent in 1942 in various towns or cities by the German occupation police to the police of the town where that person's occupying, asking for details of that person. So again, it's tracking the whereabouts and activities of Jews who may have moved from one town to another. Next slide, please. And here, we're now in Bulgaria, and this is something completed by a lady called Sonia Levy, and explaining how to fill in this document, which is a declaration of Jewish origins form that was required by Bulgarian law of 1942. So again, even in Bulgaria, we are seeing Jews having to identify themselves and then their assets. Okay, next slide, please. This is the Official Gazette of Italy, front page on the left, and then photocopies of inside pages. There's nothing to see, as it were, on the front page for these purposes, but you can see that it's the Official Italian Gazette of 1944. But when you look at the following page, which you can see there, and what you see are decrees under the heading in the right-hand column, just over halfway down, Disposizioni Comunicati, confisca a favore dello Stato di beni appartenenti al signor Usiglio Celestio fu Alessandro di Raza Ebraica. So, in other words, the state is confiscating the apartment of a Jew. Ebraica means Jew, Usiglio Celestano, and it's in the Gazette. And the next page is yet more of those announcements. In Modena, confiscated the state the apartment of Israelitica di Finale Emilia, and then below that, of the confiscated to the state the apartment of Signora Valobra Esther di Pacifico di Razza Ebraica, and so on. So the Italians are confiscating property belonging to Jews who have left the country. Obviously, they fled from fascist Italy, and now here those absent Jews' properties are being confiscated by the state. The next slide, please. You may have heard of the film called Voyage of the Damned, and this was a reference to Jews who had United States entry certificates, who sailed on the German island of St. Louis in 1939 May to the United States, and yet the United States refused to let them enter. And this is a document, or this is a leaflet from that ship, the St. Louis, albeit nothing to do with that particular journey. And many of those people were refused entry in the US, Colombia, Chile, Paraguay, Argentina. So they had to come back to Europe. Britain took in 287 of them. Others went to Holland, Belgium, and France, but that wasn't necessarily a good outcome for them there. Okay, next slide, please. Which is the other side of what you've just seen. So next slide, please. Here we have two postcards sent by refugees, Polish refugees who fled from the Germans into Russia, and sending back postcards to family, in the first case in Haifa, or in both cases in Haifa. So, you know, the refugees are communicating with family in Haifa. Okay, next slide, please. So, many Jews escaped from Europe into Shanghai, because Shanghai was one of the very few places that didn't require Jews to have entry certificates. They could just simply come, and they were welcomed there. And something over 30,000 Jews got to Shanghai in the war years, and the Chinese didn't have any antagonism towards them, and they settled in an area in Shanghai. And when the Japanese occupied Shanghai, and the Germans said to the Japanese, basically, ghettoize them and then we'll deal with them, the Japanese did force the Jews to live within what became known as the Shanghai ghetto area and a few streets, but the Japanese left them alone, and they all survived and went their various ways after the war ended. But there was a significant population of Jews in Shanghai then during the war years, and their only problem was sustaining themselves in what were very difficult economic circumstances. And what now follows are the next few slides, correspondence. Next slide, please. To and from those refugees in Shanghai. So this is from someone, Mrs. Eisenstadt in Wilson Lane, to Mr. Ansbach in Shanghai, China. And the next slide, please. This is from Germany in 1939, addressed to Georg Hohenstein in Shanghai, China. And the next slide, please. These are postcards sent from Shanghai, China to relatives. The first top one, the left one in Vienna, and the right-hand one in Russian-occupied Poland. And then the next slide, please. A Jewish German refugee in Shanghai sending a postcard to a Jewish refugee in London. And then this one, the next slide, please, is a 3-page letter sent after the war to someone from Germany into the International Red Cross in Shanghai, China. And then the next one is a card that goes from L. Schultz, care of UNRRA in Kaifeng, China, to Mr. and Mrs. Berman in New York City. And UNRWA was the United Nations Refugee Agency that was helping refugees in Shanghai. Okay, next slide, please. There were refugees who had gone to Chile, and here you see letters from France addressed to Max Reinberg, care of the Committee for the Protection of Jewish Immigrants in Santiago, Chile. And so that was obviously an address from which the refugees could pick up their mail. And then next slide, please. Again, more refugee mail. This time it's from the one on the left is from England to Bogota in Colombia, and the one on the right is from Lisbon to someone called Jacob Holtz, but of course you've got to put Israel in the middle of his name, in October 1940 in Hamburg. So showing basically Jews as refugees scattered around the world. And just a few more before we have to finish. Next slide, please. Operation Kindertransport you'll have heard of. And so here on the left you've got a cover commemorating that, and then on the right Britain did a series of stamps, and it's the top row on the left you've got Nicholas Winton, who organised one of the Kindertransports. And then next slide, please. You've got a Jewish refugee sending a postcard, giving his address as Mr. Watson, to an address in, look, Vienna, Germany. And of course that was after the Anschluss, and hence Vienna was regarded as Germany. Just if you permit me a few more pages and then we'll wind up. Next slide, please. This was more refugee mail sent from Ida Welt in Geneva to Letchworth. And then another one, please. This was, next slide, please. This was addressed from Hungary to Kitchener Camp, and Kitchener Camp was where Jewish refugees were being accommodated by the British before they had, if they had nowhere else to go. And then just finally with Jewish refugees in England, next item, and this is mainly for the benefit of any pharmacists. Richard Dreyfuss and Roger Wolf, I think, were both looking. These were prescriptions for Jewish refugees. The interesting part on the left hand, if you can just read it because it's in pencil: sulfadine of opium. Now, I'm not sure you'd be able to get a prescription for that today, but that was the prescription that was issued by the Jewish Refugees Committee, 16th of December 1941. Okay, just moving on. Cards for a lady called Paula Barbier, her membership card to the Jewish Czech refugee hostel. And moving on, her daughter went to school, Greta Barbier, and this was a question issued of whether she was allowed to reside in the area of the school, which was in Margate, and the Regional Advisory Committee had to decide whether this schoolgirl, a refugee, could be in Margate. And then if you turn to the next page, you'll see their decision: notification to an alien of the committee's recommendation that he should leave a prohibited area. Greta wasn't allowed to stay at school in Margate. She had to go. And then the next page, please. You can see the justification. Oh, you jumped two. Back one. That's the Aliens Protected Areas Order, important police notice saying that it's been decided that it's not possible to allow aliens to reside in certain parts of the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex and Kent, which lie approximately within 20 miles of the coast. That's why Greta had to leave her school. And then the last item is the York City Police confirming there's no objection to Max and Greta Weiss, and this is Greta has now married, changing their address in New York, in York in 1941. So we'll have to leave it there, but I hope that you've seen some of the material now that demonstrates how things were happening to the Jews who had starting with the hyperinflation and anti-Semitism in Germany, followed by their disenfranchisement and expropriation of assets, and in turn them fleeing and having to survive as refugees from Nazis and elsewhere. We'll carry on with the remaining sections of that at some future date when I can show you the rest of this particular display. Thank you.